This is part 2 of the lecture on models of linguistic change. Okay, so on Tuesday we talked about some basic problems in linguistic change. We talked about the family tree model and the wave model. Today we're going to talk about sociolinguistics and how it relates to language change. We're going to talk about two phenomena known as lexical diffusion and near mergers. And we're going to talk about a technique known as glottochronology. Okay, so first, sociolinguistics. There's a traditional problem known as the Saussurean paradox. And the problem is stated like this. So if language is an orderly system of relations, how is it possible that language can be used successfully as a medium for communication when it's in the middle of a large number of changes, right? As all languages always are, right? If the system is always changing, how is it possible that we're all still able to use it to communicate successfully with each other? So if you think of it as an analogy, it would be like playing football while the rules keep being changed during the game. And that would obviously be a problem, but the fact that language continues to be changed doesn't seem to be a problem at all for users of language. And in fact, most of the changes that are ongoing go by completely unnoticed by users of language. Okay, so why would that be the case? So that's the Saussurean paradox, and until the 60s it really was a paradox. Nobody had any idea why that would be the case. And then along came sociolinguistics, which was only discovered or developed in the 1960s as a field. And basically what sociolinguistics let us understand was that change doesn't really disrupt language. Right? Change, or actually variability, is a built-in feature of language. Okay, so that's why it isn't disruptive. It's because it's always there. Okay, so first let's talk about variation. Okay, so there's always variation in every language. Right? No language is completely homogeneous. So an obvious type of variation is regional variation, right, which we know as dialects. But often even within a single community, like a single town, a single village, there will still be variation. So there can be variation between social groups, right? So between women and men, between different classes, between different occupations. But even variation within a single speaker. Okay, so speakers of English will be able to pronounce did you, right, either carefully as did you or as did ya in more flowing speech. So a single speaker can have both of those different pronunciations, right? This is variation within a single speaker. That's an example of phonological variation. Also lexical variation, so a simple example, whether you say telephone or phone. Those are two variants of the same lexical item. So there's lots of variation like this, and the basic insight of modern sociolinguistics is that this variation is not arbitrary and it's not insignificant. There are often statistically significant correlations between linguistic variables, like how you pronounce did ya, and social variables, such as age, sex, occupation, class, and so on. So a classic work in sociolinguistics is Labov's famous study of R in New York City, so the pronunciation of R. There's variation in New York City in whether R is pronounced after vowels or not. So the phrase fourth floor can be pronounced with the R, like I just said it, or without the R, like fourth floor, something like that. What he found in his study, so he did a famous study in a department store where he asked a bunch of people where a certain department was, and he knew it was on the fourth floor. So he got a whole bunch of people to say fourth floor, and he saw whether or not they pronounced the R. And what he found was that everyone had both variants. And so all the people in his study sometimes used an R and sometimes didn't. What he found, though, was that the lower somebody's social class was, the more likely they use the variant without an R, and the higher their social class, the more likely they use the variant with the R. That's oversimplifying his results a bit, but that was the basic finding. So what you can conclude from this is that those two different variants are really functioning as markers of different social groups. Right? The more R you use, the more you're showing that you belong in or you identify with a higher social class. So the way we talk about this is that we say that variants are doing sociolinguistic work. Okay, by using a particular variant, you're positioning yourself in a certain way, or you're showing your status or your affiliation with a certain group. Of course, you're doing it subconsciously. People don't actually realize, for the most part, what their variants are signifying, but the statistics still show that they do signify these things. So this is just part of using language, is being able to control these different variants, using the particular variants that are appropriate to your sociolinguistic group. Okay, so this is just part of the ability to use language. You can call it your sociolinguistic competence. Okay, so it's an inherent part of language. So how does that explain change? Okay, so the thing is, so variation is there's always variation. The thing is, it's not stable over time in many cases. Right? So the use of different variants tends to change. So here's a graph of the use of intensifiers in Toronto. So words like, well, in this graph, it's very, really, and so. Okay, so like very happy, really happy, so happy. So what this graph shows, so across the bottom of the graph is the age group of the people studied, and then along the side is the percentage at which they use each of those three lexical items. Okay, so this graph, it's showing change in time, but it isn't really, right? It's actually showing different age groups, and we're assuming the way the older people speak is an older form of the language, and the way the younger people speak is a newer form of the language. And so this kind of graph, we call it an apparent time graph. Okay, so we assume that the variation across age groups reflects an ongoing change. Okay, so what we're seeing here, right, is that there's variation, right, in which intensifier is used, and that variation isn't stable. It's been changing over time. So what you'll notice is that very has had a pretty significant decline. Really has had a really significant increase, and then more recently, so is also picking up. Okay, so the younger people, 24 to 29 age group in this study, are the ones who are really starting to use so a lot. Okay, so the variation, the point here, has been changing over time. Right, in each age group, there's variation, but there's just a different type of variation, right? Different rate of use of each variant. So what we're actually seeing here is language change. Right? So if you think about it, if we come back in 100 years, maybe very will have been completely replaced by so. Okay, so that we could see that as just a simple language change, right? A simple change in the vocabulary. But how that change would really come about was just through a gradual change in the frequency of different variants. Okay, so there wasn't a replacement like one for one. It was just there was variation among these three lexical items, and gradually so was used more and more. Gradually very was used less and less. Probably the same thing explains a lot of cases of sound change. So when we're doing historical linguistics and we're looking back over centuries, we just always say is that P became B, right? As though it just happened suddenly one day. But if we were there at the time to do a sociolinguistic study, we'd probably find that it was really a progression. And so probably the standard was B, and then at some point there was this non-standard variant, B. Right? Sorry, the standard was P, and there was a non-standard variant B, right, that was used by certain groups and started to be used at some point. And then probably there was a gradual expansion in the use of B, right? Just as there was an expansion in the use of so in the intensifier graph. So maybe the group who originally used it started using it with a greater frequency. Maybe it spread then to the adjacent social group and continued to spread and grow in frequency over decades. And then what you find is that after a generation or two, if that kept on going, then maybe eventually B would be used in all contexts by all speakers. And so the variation would have kept changing until B became the variant that was used everywhere. So after the end of all that, the outcome is a sound change, right? The outcome is P becomes B, but there was no point in time where that change just suddenly happened for everybody, right? It wasn't that everyone woke up one morning and started saying B rather than P, right? There was just variation, and over time the variants were gradually redistributed until eventually there was a complete change.